Okay, hi. Um, we're going to talk a little bit, try to make up some lost ground because we've had some bad weather. So we're going to talk a little bit about chapter 11 in Donna Wood's book, Egoism. And particularly, I'm going to talk a little bit about Ayn Rand, who's a rather famous author, philosopher from the 1900s. And I've been advised, I've done some of these talking head videos before, and I think it's generally true. I've been recently advised by some colleagues, you do one take and then you just put it up. So I'm not going to be involved in any editing or anything like that. I do have the PowerPoints printed out, and I'm going to kind of follow them quickly. And also I want to keep, I might do 2 videos. I'll try to keep them to somewhere in the 10 to 12 minute range, which I think is probably best. So we're entering an interesting section of the course, which has to do, at least there are a couple chapters here that have to do with moral theories. Explanations as to how we live the good life, what is right and what is wrong. And we're going to look at 4 chapters in Donna Wood. She's actually got 6 total. We're going to start with egoism, then a little, in the next few weeks we'll get to utilitarianism, rights, and then justice. So if you look at the PowerPoints, we start off with, I invoke the memory of one of the great music stars, at least of my generation, John Lennon, and I ask you to imagine what if you could have complete freedom in your world. What if you could keep all the money and all the wealth that you really made? And we could have an interesting conversation about this and use some examples in class, but we could get to the premise that you don't really get the opportunity to choose how a lot of your money is spent. There's this democratic process that do you really have a choice about whether or not you're going to pay any taxes, for instance? And what if you could keep the money that you actually earn? And chances are, if you've got a job, even if it's only a part-time job, that somewhere on the order of a quarter to a third of your paycheck is gone before you even have a chance to see it. So what if you could keep that money? And what if all of us could do that? Think of the potential benefits we could have to an economy if we could keep what we earn. Now, of course, we're going to sacrifice some things, some protections that we're typically used to. So think about the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, Consumer Product Safety Commission, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. There are all these government agencies, and I think there are something like 55, 56 in total. They cost a lot of money to run, and they also cost a lot of money for us to comply with these regulations. They take away a lot of our freedom to act like we want to act. Now, if these agencies really produce value, couldn't the marketplace do it more efficiently? So imagine, for instance, if you had a choice between, do you want an airbag on your car? Why should the government tell you or force you to have an airbag on your car? Why should the government require us to have catalytic converters on our car, which reduce pollution? Well, the argument is we all have to do this, but what if we don't want this? What if we're not, what if we're not really willing to spend the money on it? If we value a clean environment, we'll pay for it. The marketplace will give it to us. Again, you can imagine we could go off into some interesting conversations about personal choice, personal responsibility, whether the marketplace could really deliver on what you really want if you want a clean environment. We could also talk about cheating or free riding in a way. So imagine that as kind of a setup. And this leads us to anyway, it's a nice segue into this one theory, moral theory called egoism. The theory that your primary responsibility, your ultimate responsibility, is to provide for your own happiness, is to take care of yourself. And there are a couple of kinds of egoism, actually 3 that Donna Wood talks about. We're primarily interested in 2, and even particularly 1. She talks about psychological egoism, which is descriptive in nature. People are self-centered because we have to be in order to survive. We can't help it. So it describes the way things are. Ethical egoism, which is our real interest, is about how things should be. That we really should be self-centered. We should be self-interested and self-motivated. Our own happiness should be our primary goal in life. There's a third one called minimalist egoism, and anyway, you'll read about the definition in the textbook. But particularly the emphasis in chapter 11 in egoism here is on this is the way it should be. And if you think about a capitalist or market-based economy, it's not surprising that we use a lot of egoistic kind of assumptions or principles, because we assume that people are going to be self-interested as they choose transactions that they're involved in. So now we get to this writer, Ayn Rand. And she has written a number of essays, but of particular interest are a couple of novels that she wrote in the 1900s. The first one actually was a second novel, but the first one we're going to discuss is The Fountainhead, Realistic Knowledge. And this was written shortly after World War II. And then her third book, which is really kind of, I don't want to say masterpiece, that's not really quite the right word, but one of her very notable books, Atlas Shrugged, which was published, I believe, 1956, 1957, something like that. The personal history of Ayn Rand bears a little bit of attention. Ayn Rand was born, I don't know her birth name. She was born to Jewish parents in, I believe, St. Petersburg. She grew up in St. Petersburg, Russia, 1905, I believe. And she's 12 years old at the Russian Revolution, 1917. And as I've read it, she came from a kind of a fairly well-off middle-class merchant family in St. Petersburg. But after the revolution, the family lost everything. And it was kind of devastating. I mean, personal property of theirs was seized, and so she saw this complete change in Russian society as a young woman, and she absolutely despised it. Shortly thereafter, she was sent to the United States to live with relatives. And so she really kind of comes of age in the United States and has fled her homeland and has just had a very bad experience back in Russia with communism. Here in the United States, as she grows up and she, as a young woman, she moves in the 1920s. She moves to Hollywood and she works for some movie studios, I believe, in costume design or costume sets, and starts writing some essays, writing some short screenplays, and eventually her writing really kind of takes off. And shortly after World War II, some of her own philosophies really begin to coalesce around the idea that socialism or collectivism and altruism, the idea that altruism is kind of the opposite of egoism, the idea that our moral responsibility is not to ourselves, that's egoism, but altruism maintains that our moral responsibility is to others. So I might ask you the question, so for instance, why do you give money to charity? I assume some of you, most of you, give money from time to time to charity, and certainly when you get jobs, you're going to probably think a little bit more about charity. I said, well, why would you do that? And there are kind of a couple of reasons that people will talk about when they talk about giving money away, or for instance volunteering. And one is that there are a number of points of self-interest. I do it because I feel I want to do it. I feel like I'm a better person when I do it, or I feel like it improves my community. If it improves my community, that's good for me. Altruism says no, you should do it because it's good for somebody else. You should do it not because you're expecting something in return, whether it's a feeling of even if it's a feeling of self-satisfaction, that might occur, but your obligation to others that's why you should help them out. If you have money and somebody else does not, you're obliged to help them out. Well, this idea, if you take it to a large scale, you take it to the government level, and particularly if you start imagining it's the 1940s in the United States, and we've had a period called the New Deal. If you understand something about American history, just before the war, we had the Great Depression, and Franklin Roosevelt comes in, And he starts bringing in all these government programs. He introduces the first minimum wage. He introduces the Works Projects Administration, which finds jobs for people who are idle, and they're fixing roads and bridges and making buildings and things like that. But it's a public sector jobs program. He introduces Social Security. There are a number of other labor laws that begin to emerge during the 30s and 40s. And Ayn Rand sees this as creeping socialism. She sees this as actually, in a way, kind of scarier than socialism by revolution, which is what she experienced as a youth. And so she's trying in her books to warn us about where we're heading. Atlas Shrugged, I always like to ask students in a class if people have read Atlas Shrugged. When I was in college, there were always a few people, they tended to be the brainiacs, but it was not uncommon for people to read Atlas Shrugged. I finally read it in the 1990s, about 25 years too late. But I did finally read it. It's 1,100 pages long. It's very small print. It will take you a long time. But at some point in your lives, I will say it's a good book to be familiar with. Whether you undertake the effort of actually reading it, that's up to you. There are a lot of my students that tell me a year or two later that they have read it, and some people have had their lives changed by it. I see I'm almost at the 12-minute mark, so I want to put a pause here, and I'll come back and continue a second video. We'll talk a little bit more about Ayn Rand's moral theory of objectivism, its connection with egoism. We'll talk a little bit more about Atlas Shrugged in a second tape. All right, thanks.